The chipped formica of the security desk was cold under my elbows. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something older, like dust motes and forgotten coffee. Old Man Hemlock, the guy finishing his shift, just left. He didn't walk me through anything, didn't offer a pep talk about the peculiarities of guarding a university library at 11 p.m. He just handed me a ring of keys that felt surprisingly heavy and a manila folder, mumbled, "Good luck," and was gone. Vanished into the near darkness of the main hall. I flipped open the folder. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed on what looked like a very old electric typewriter. Library security protocols, night shift. Great. Protocols. Like I was launching a space shuttle, not making sure teenagers didn't try to make out in the stacks. Still, $50,000 in medical bills doesn't exactly give you room to be picky. A stable paycheck, even a small one, was gold right now. The list was odd, numbered, single-spaced. I started reading aloud, mostly to fill the silence. 1. Do not enter the rare books archive for any reason. Okay, fair enough. Makes sense. The rare books archive was basically a fortress within a fortress. I'd seen it during my tour a week ago. Steel door, keypad, the whole deal. 2. Every 2 hours, record the temperature reading from the thermostat in the main hall in the physical log. Do not estimate. Do not skip entries. That was specific and a little annoying. I preferred digital logs, but whatever. 2 hours. I could handle that. 3. Between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., do not move, do not speak, do not use the lights. Now, that was just weird. An hour of complete stillness in a huge, echoing building. I chuckled. Some previous night guard clearly had a vivid imagination or a really elaborate prank to play on newcomers. 4. If you hear something dragging across linoleum, do not investigate. Leave the area immediately. Dragging across linoleum? What, like a chair? Was this place haunted by mischievous furniture? I rolled my eyes. Still, it was a strangely unsettling image. 5. Do not photograph, record, or write down the Dewey Decimal numbers of the books on the 3rd floor. That one stopped me. What? Why? It felt targeted, like someone knew exactly what a security guard might be tempted to do to alleviate boredom. I pictured myself, half asleep, meticulously cataloging the 3rd floor's collection just to stay awake. 6. If you find ceramic dogs arranged in a circle, do not disturb it. Report using code 72B, ceramic dogs. I pictured a little collection, maybe left by a student. Harmless, right? But the instruction, the specific code, it felt strangely urgent. 7. Always count the stairs when using the east stairwell. If the count differs from the last time, do not proceed. Return the way you came. I made a mental note to avoid the east stairwell. Counting stairs sounded exhausting, and what even happened if the count was off? Did the stairs shift? I dismissed the thought. Old building, probably just settling. 8. Cover or avoid the mirrors in the east wing after 1 a.m. Mirrors? Seriously? Was this a set of instructions for a horror movie? I glanced at the small mirror hanging behind me, reflecting the empty hallway. It didn't seem particularly threatening. 9. If you hear singing, do not investigate. Leave the area immediately. Singing? Okay, now someone was definitely having a laugh. Probably college students pulling a prank. I read the list again, slowly. The more I read it, the less funny it seemed. It wasn't the individual rules themselves, but the sheer volume of them, the specificity, the quiet insistence. It felt less like a prank and more like a set of precautions against something. I sighed, pushing the folder aside. Probably just eccentric former employees. This university was old, steeped in tradition. Maybe this was just part of the folklore. I needed to focus on the job, on keeping the place secure, on earning a paycheck. The library was quiet, almost oppressively so. The fluorescent lights hummed, a low, constant drone. The air smelled of old paper and binding glue. I ran a hand over the cool metal of the security console. The display flickered to life, showing a grid of security cameras, all clear for now. I glanced at the clock, 11:07 p.m. My shift had officially begun. I picked up the logbook, a thick leather-bound volume, and opened it to the correct date. The thermostat read 68 degrees. I wrote it down, careful to make my handwriting legible. The silence settled around me again, heavier this time. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but it wasn't a feeling of being watched by a person. It was something else, something imprecise. I told myself it was just the exhaustion, just the weight of everything, just a new job in a strange old building. I was doing inventory, not books, thankfully. Old equipment, microfilm readers, broken projectors, a box of cassette tapes labeled Oral History Project, 1982. Mostly junk the university had forgotten about, stuffed in the basement storage room off the main lobby. The room smelled like dust and disappointment. It was cool down there, even colder than the rest of the library, and the concrete floor sucked the heat out of my shoes. I was supposed to catalog everything, note its condition, and flag anything that could be disposed of. A pointless task, I figured. The university didn't need a detailed inventory of broken technology, but Mr. Henderson, the facilities manager, was a stickler for procedure. I was halfway through a stack of old film reels, carefully noting the warped plastic and faded labels when I heard it. A sound. Faint at first, like someone calling out from a distance. It was hard to place. A muffled cry. A sob? It sounded young. I paused, pen hovering over the log sheet. Probably just the heating system, I thought. Old buildings make weird noises. Pipes groan, vents whistle. I went back to the film reels, trying to ignore it. The sound came again, a little clearer this time. Definitely a voice. A child, maybe? Help me. It was so quiet, so fragile. I glanced up from the reels, listening intently. It seemed to be coming from down the hall, near the rare books section. That section was closed to the public, of course. Locked doors, climate control, the works, but still, someone could be lost. I stood up, my chair scraping against the concrete floor. My gut clenched. I hadn't seen anyone else since Old Man Hemlock, the previous guard, had briefed me. Hemlock hadn't mentioned anything about lost children, or anyone for that matter. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the confined space. No response. Just the faint, persistent sound. "Please help." It was definitely a child now. A girl, I thought. Her voice was small, desperate. My first instinct was to go find her, to make sure she was all right. I started walking towards the hall, my pace quickening with each step. My wife Sarah would kill me if something happened to a kid on my watch, especially with everything else going on. The medical bills, the worry, I needed this job. I couldn't afford to lose it over something like this. Then, something flickered at the edge of my memory. A warning. Something about sounds about not investigating. I couldn't quite grasp it. It felt like a half-remembered dream, a vague feeling of unease. Something about if you heard something you just left. I racked my brain, trying to recall the details. It was in that folder Hemlock had given me. All those strange rules. I stopped walking, my hand reaching for the doorframe of the hallway. The sound was louder now, much louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a cry for help. It was a plea, a desperate, frantic plea. "Help me. He's going to... The voice trailed off, choked with sobs. My blood ran cold. The sound wasn't coming from the rare books section. It was coming through the walls. It was inside the walls. My breath hitched. That feeling, that imprecise sense of being watched, intensified. It wasn't watching me anymore. It was listening. I remembered a fragment of the rule, sharp and clear. If you hear "don't investigate, leave the area." It hadn't been about prank calls or faulty wiring. It had been about this, about whatever was making that sound. I turned around, my legs feeling heavy as lead. I walked. No, I practically ran back to the storage room, ignoring the increasingly frantic cries that seemed to follow me. The sound was getting closer, as if whatever was making it was gaining on me. I sat down heavily in my chair, heart thudding a ragged rhythm against my ribs. I didn't feel my usual heat flush, just a cold, prickly sensation on the back of my neck. I covered my ears with my hands, but the sound seeped through, a relentless, horrifying whisper. The cries eventually faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. I sat there for a long time, staring at the inventory list, unable to focus. The smell of dust and disappointment suddenly felt suffocating. I finished the inventory, mechanically, forcing myself to write down the details of each item. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying the sound, trying to understand what I had just experienced. I had followed the rule, but it hadn't made me feel safe. It had made me feel exposed, like I had narrowly avoided something terrible, but hadn't escaped it entirely. I looked at the clock. Only 2 hours had passed. 8 more to go. And now I knew the quiet nights were over. The fluorescent lights hummed, a steady, irritating drone. I was reshelving books in the history section, the Dewey Decimal System my only companion. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and after the incident in the basement, quiet was good. Mostly just biographies tonight. Presidents, generals, a surprising number about obscure Victorian poets. I tried to focus on the spines, the weight of the books in my hands, the precise click as I slotted them into place. Anything to keep my mind from replaying that voice. It was nearly midnight. The university was a ghost town. The only sounds my footsteps on the polished linoleum and the occasional creak of the building settling. I'd made a fresh pot of coffee a couple of hours ago, and the bitter smell still lingered, a small comfort. Sarah would appreciate that I hadn't fallen asleep on the job. She worried enough as it was, with me taking these shifts. She didn't understand the need, not really, but she didn't complain. Just packed me a thermos and reminded me to stay warm. I finished the history section and moved on to political science. Another few hours of this and I could start on the periodicals. It wasn't stimulating work, but it paid the bills. Or at least it chipped away at the mountain of medical bills, $52,347. That's what I'd checked this morning before leaving. It felt like a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. Around 15 a.m., I decided to do a quick head count. Part of the routine, I guess. Mostly to confirm I was alone. It felt silly, to be honest. Who would be sneaking around a university library at this hour? Still, it was in the checklist. I started at the main entrance, checking the security cameras. Empty. Then the reference desk, empty. The periodicals section, empty. The computer labs, empty. I walked toward the back, past the rare books room, still locked, as it should be, and into the stacks where I'd been working. And that's when I noticed it. There was someone in the reading room at the very end of the hall. A single figure hunched over a table, illuminated by the small desk lamp. I hadn't seen anyone enter, hadn't heard a thing. My first thought was a student who'd gotten caught up in their work and forgotten the time. It happened. I walked towards the figure, intending to politely inform them the library was closed. As I got closer, I glanced at the sign-in sheet at the front desk, the one we were supposed to keep updated. 5 signatures. 5 people had signed in earlier that evening. But I counted 6 people on the cameras. And now, standing in the reading room, 1 more. A knot formed in my stomach. My pulse picked up. Not a frantic pounding, but a slow, heavy thud. It was probably just a mistake. I'd miscounted. Maybe someone had signed in and out without me noticing. It was a big library. I double-checked the cameras, rewinding the footage. 5 people entered. No one left. I looked at the sign-in sheet again, scrutinizing each name, each shaky signature. 5. Then, something flickered in my memory. A document, a list of protocols. Something about visitors, something about not confronting. A rule. It wasn't clear, just a vague feeling of unease associated with the phrase unsenged guests. Something about a code. I couldn't quite grasp the details, but the feeling was insistent, a cold prickle on my skin. I remembered a feeling more than the words themselves of a very strong warning. If someone is inside who shouldn't be, don't engage, don't ask questions. My hand instinctively reached for the radio clipped to my belt. My thumb hovered over the transmit button. The code. I remembered reading something about a specific code to call. I couldn't for the life of me recall what it was. I forced myself to take a deep breath. Forget the code, forget trying to understand, just don't confront. I slowly backed out of the reading room, keeping my eyes on the figure. They hadn't moved, they hadn't even looked up. They just continued to hunch over the table, bathed in the warm glow of the desk lamp. The air in the hallway suddenly felt thick, hard to breathe. My throat was dry. I walked quickly now, back to the front desk. I sat down, my legs shaking slightly. I stared at the radio, then at the sign-in sheet, then back at the security cameras. The figure was still there, motionless. I didn't call anyone. I didn't know the code. I didn't want to risk saying the wrong thing. I just sat there, frozen, for the next hour, listening to the hum of the lights and the frantic beat of my own pulse. Every creak of the building, every shift in the shadows, sent a jolt of fear through me. By 2:30 a.m., the figure was gone, vanished. The reading room was empty, but the sign-in sheet still held only 5 names. And I knew with a chilling certainty that something had been in the library that shouldn't have been. Something I hadn't acknowledged, something I hadn't confronted, and following the rule hadn't made me feel any better. It felt like I just lost a piece of the certainty that I could keep this place safe, lost a little bit of myself. The chipped formica of the circulation desk felt cool under my forearms. It was 3:17 a.m., and I was reshelving the returned books, mostly paperbacks, thrillers, and romances judging by the covers. Mrs. Henderson, the day librarian, was a stickler for the Dewey Decimal System. She'd have my hide if she knew I'd left a stack of true crime novels out of order for even 5 minutes. It was mindless work, but I needed the distraction. The silence of the library at this hour was thick. Not peaceful, just heavy. I was on the 800s, poetry and drama, a surprisingly popular section considering I sorted through the returns, smoothing out bent pages, aligning spines. It was almost meditative, almost. I kept glancing at the security monitors. Nothing, just empty carols and shadowed stacks. I'd made a fresh pot of coffee earlier, and the smell, even hours later, clung to the air, a weak, bitter comfort. It was while I was shelving a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets that I noticed it. On the floor, in the middle of the aisle, someone had arranged a circle of books. Not a neat, deliberate circle. It was messy, almost frantic, books of all sizes, all colors, all subjects, poetry, history, science textbooks, even a few children's picture books. They weren't stacked, just laid flat, spines facing inwards, creating a ring about 3 feet in diameter. My first thought was students, drunken students probably. A late-night study session gone wrong. Though it was a weeknight, exams were over. It didn't really track. I frowned, trying to recall if I'd seen any students lingering after closing. Nothing. I bent down, intending to just fix it. Straighten things up. It was a hazard. Someone could trip, and Mrs. Henderson would definitely have my hide. As I reached for a copy of Moby Dick lying askew, a strange sensation prickled at the back of my neck. A sudden chill. It wasn't a temperature drop. The thermostat read a consistent 68 degrees, but something colder. Something wrong. I paused, my hand hovering over the book. It wasn't just the messiness of it. The arrangement felt intentional, not playful, like a prank, deliberate and unsettling. Then, a flash of something in my memory. That document, the protocols. I'd skimmed it, mostly dismissing it as bureaucratic overreach. But there was something about arrangements, about patterns, something about not disturbing them. It wasn't a clear memory, more a feeling of dread associated with a specific phrase. Do not interfere, or maybe it was do not alter. I couldn't remember the exact wording. I straightened up slowly, my back protesting the movement. I scanned the security cameras again, still nothing, just the empty aisles. I told myself it was exhaustion. I hadn't been sleeping well since Sarah's surgery. The worry, the bills, it was getting to me. I was seeing things. But the chill hadn't dissipated. If anything, it was intensifying. It felt like the air around the circle was thinner, like it was pulling at something. I remembered a fragment, a warning about reporting it, a code. I racked my brain, trying to recall the procedure. If you encounter an arrangement, Something about a specific code to use with dispatch, but it remained elusive, locked away somewhere in the fog of my sleep-deprived mind. I took a step back, away from the circle. My hand instinctively went to my radio. I hesitated. Calling it in felt absurd. Explaining a circle of books to dispatch at 3:30 in the morning, they'd think I was losing it. But the feeling persisted. The uneasy prickle on my skin. The sense of being watched. The cold. I forced myself to breathe evenly. I had to follow the procedures, whatever they were, even if they seemed ridiculous. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes fixed on the circle. I didn't touch it, didn't move a single book. I walked to the front desk, my legs feeling strangely heavy. I sat down, my heart doing a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. It wasn't a racing panic, but a dull, persistent ache. I stared at the circle through the security monitor. It looked different now. Or maybe it was just my imagination. The shadows seemed to be shifting around it, deepening, swirling. The air in the library felt even colder, and I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible humming sound. I didn't call dispatch. I couldn't remember the code. I couldn't bring myself to sound like a fool. I just sat there and watched for almost an hour. And as I watched, the humming grew louder, the shadows more pronounced. The books within the circle seemed to settle, to sink slightly into the floor. I swear for a moment I saw a faint swirling mist rising from the center of the arrangement. By the time my shift ended and the morning librarian arrived, the circle was gone. The books were scattered haphazardly, as if someone had simply lost interest and walked away. But the cold lingered, and the humming, and the unsettling feeling that I'd failed to understand something important, something dangerous. I logged it in the incident report as disorderly conduct, books misplaced. It felt inadequate. But what else could I say? I hadn't seen anything. I just felt it. And that, I knew, wouldn't be enough for anyone to believe me. The chipped formica of the front desk felt cool under my forearms. It was 2:17 a.m., and I was inventorying the returned books. Not a glamorous task, but it broke up the monotony. Mostly textbooks and romance novels. A few thrillers. The usual I'd put on a vinyl record, some old John Prine, quiet enough to be background noise but loud enough to drown out the hum of the fluorescent lights. It was a good system. It kept me from spiraling too much about the bills. I scanned the barcode of a particularly dog-eared copy of Calculus for Dummies. The scanner beeped. The computer registered it, and I stacked it neatly with the others. It wasn't a lot of books, not on a Tuesday night. Students mostly returned things before a big deadline, or waited until the last possible second. Rarely a trickle like this. That's when I noticed the clock, 2:33 a.m., and the temperature. It had dropped, significantly. The library's climate control was usually rock solid, a little too enthusiastic even, but now a distinct chill had settled in, raising the hairs on my arms. I glanced at the thermostat. Still set to 72, I shivered anyway. Just a draft, I told myself. An old building, bound to have quirks. Then I noticed the logbook, the physical logbook, the one the university insisted we still use, despite everything being digital now. It sat next to the computer, a heavy, leather-bound volume. And there was a note taped to the cover. A new note. I hadn't put it there. It was a small, yellow sticky note, handwritten in blocky, uneven letters. Read entry 17. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen a note like this before. It wasn't on the list of protocols. I scanned the desk, checking for a camera I might have missed during training. Nothing. Just the usual security equipment, my radio, the computer, the logbook. I hesitated. I didn't like this. It felt wrong. Like someone was deliberately trying to mess with me. But the university was full of eccentric professors and sleep-deprived students. Probably just a prank. A dumb one. I opened the logbook. The pages were filled with neat, meticulous entries. Dates, times, brief descriptions of anything out of the ordinary. A leaky pipe, a flickering light bulb, a student sleeping in the reading room. Standard stuff. I flipped to entry 17. The date was 3 weeks ago. written by Old Man Hemlock, the previous security guard. His handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. 2:33 a.m. Temp drop of 15 degrees in Section C. Readings erratic. Noted static on all radio channels. Appears to correlate with a distortion in the periphery. Difficult to describe. Repeatedly checked security cameras. No anomalies detected. Logged readings as per directive. A distortion in the periphery. Readings as per directive? I frowned, trying to recall the training manual. Something about intervals and readings. I remembered a feeling of strictness, a sense that it was absolutely crucial to follow procedure. Something about every 2 hours. And taking temperature readings from multiple locations and recording them in the logbook. No estimation, no skipping. I couldn't remember the exact phrasing. The training had been a blur of forms and jargon. I glanced at the clock, 2:33 a.m., the same time as the entry. The temperature was still dropping. I could feel it in my bones. The static on the radio had increased, a faint crackling that buzzed in my ears. I checked Section C on the security monitors. Nothing. Empty bookshelves and shadows. I grabbed a thermometer from the supply closet. I walked to Section C, my steps echoing in the silent library. I took a reading near the poetry section. 63 degrees, 15 degrees lower than the thermostat setting, just like Hemlock had written. My pulse quickened. It wasn't a draft. It wasn't a prank. Something was happening. Something Hemlock had experienced too, and he'd followed a procedure, a directive. I went back to the desk, my hand clammy. I opened the logbook to a fresh page, date, time, temperature reading for Section C. I wrote it down, my handwriting surprisingly steady. I logged the static on the radio. I listed the ambient temperature at the front desk, 70 degrees. As I wrote, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I glanced around, but the library was empty. The shadows seemed deeper, though, more defined. I finished the entry, closed the logbook, and sat back down. I felt strangely drained, like I'd just completed a difficult task, a necessary task, but I didn't feel safer. I felt exposed. I checked the clock again, 2:48 a.m. Another 15 minutes gone, another interval approaching. The radio static intensified, the temperature continued to fall, and that feeling of being watched, it hadn't gone away. It had grown. I knew with a chilling certainty that I would have to do it again at 3:03, and then again and again, and I didn't know why, just that I had to. I was reshelving books in the history section. Not a glamorous task, but someone had to do it. Mostly textbooks, heavy things with glossy covers. American history, European history, world civilizations, they all blurred together after a while. I tried to sort them alphabetically, but the Dewey Decimal System always felt arbitrary to me, like someone had decided on a complicated game just to make things harder. It was quiet, as usual. The fluorescent lights hummed, a low, constant drone that I'd almost stopped noticing. I'd started bringing my headphones, but I hadn't used them in a couple of nights. Too distracting, I decided. It was better to be aware of everything, even if everything was just the building settling and the occasional creak of the old structure. I found a stack of books someone had left on a table, Renaissance art, thick, oversized volumes. I started putting them back, carefully aligning the spines. It was almost meditative, the repetition. I remembered Mom used to like organizing things. Her kitchen was immaculate. Everything had its place. I hadn't inherited that gene, unfortunately. Our house was lived in, a polite way of saying messy. The clock ticked. 3:03. Time for another temperature reading. I glanced at the logbook. Section B this time, according to my notes. I stretched, feeling a stiffness in my lower back. This job wasn't physically demanding, but sitting and bending all night took its toll. I needed to start doing those stretches Sarah's physical therapist had recommended. As I walked towards Section B, I noticed something odd. The lights. They were flickering. Not a full-blown strobe, just a subtle wavering, like someone was gently tapping the switch. I stopped, squinting. Probably just a faulty ballast, I thought. Old building, old wiring. Maintenance would need to take a look. I made a mental note to add it to the work order list. Then the flickering stopped, and everything went quiet. Not just the usual library quiet, but a deeper, more profound silence. The hum of the lights vanished. The distant rumble of traffic faded. Even the building seemed to hold its breath. It was unsettling. I felt a sudden chill despite the relatively warm temperature. And then I remembered something about hours. Specific hours. And stillness. A fragment of the training manual swam to the surface of my memory. Something about not moving, not speaking, not using the lights during certain times. I couldn't place the exact wording, but the feeling of dread was unmistakable. It had been buried under the details of the logging procedure, the visitor protocols, the everything. I froze, standing halfway between the history section and the reference desk. My hand was outstretched. Hovering over the light switch for Section B, I lowered it slowly. It wasn't a rational fear. It was a primal urge to remain unseen, unheard. A feeling that something was listening. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I tried to breathe normally, but my chest felt tight. I glanced at the security monitors. Nothing. Still just empty bookshelves. But the silence was oppressive. It felt like the library was holding its breath with me. A shadow flickered at the periphery of my vision. It wasn't a normal shadow cast by a shelf or a chair. It was fluid, shifting. It moved against the back wall of Section B, a dark smudge that seemed to writhe and coalesce. It was gone before I could focus on it, but the impression lingered. It hadn't been caused by anything, it just was. My throat felt dry. I wanted to cough, to clear it, to break the silence. But something held me back. That remembered fragment of the training. Stillness, silence. It was a desperate, illogical impulse, but I obeyed. I stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the spot where the shadow had been. Then, I heard it. A soft, scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. It came from Section B, near the periodicals. Slow, deliberate. It wasn't the sound of a book falling or a chair being moved. It was organic, like claws on stone. I squeezed my eyes shut. I wanted to look, to see what was making the sound, but I knew I couldn't. The memory of the shadow, the suffocating silence, the urgent, unspoken rule, it was all too much. I focused on my breathing, trying to slow my racing heart. It felt like an eternity. The scraping stopped. The silence returned even more profound than before. Then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the flickering lights stabilized. The hum returned. The distant rumble of traffic seeped back into the library. I opened my eyes. The library was as it had been, empty, silent, except for the normal, everyday sounds of an old building settling. The shadow was gone. The scraping had ceased. I stood there for a long moment, trembling. My legs felt weak. I wanted to call it in to report what I'd experienced. But to whom? What would I say? I saw a shadow that shouldn't have been there, and I heard a scraping sound, and I was too afraid to move. They'd think I was losing it. I glanced at the clock, 3:07. It was over. Whatever it was gone. For now, I forced myself to walk towards Section B to take the temperature reading. 62 degrees, 15 degrees lower than the thermostat. I wrote it down in the logbook, my hand shaking slightly. I didn't log the shadow, I didn't log the scraping, I didn't log the terror. I finished my rounds, the rest of the night passing without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just barely escaped something. Something unseen, something waiting. The rules weren't just procedures anymore, they were a warning. And I had a terrible feeling they were only going to get harder to follow. The worst part of the job wasn't the quiet, or the dark, or even the creeping feeling that I was being watched. It was the dust, decades of it, coating everything, every shelf, every spine, every surface. Tonight, I was tasked with wiping down the reference section. A pointless exercise, really. It would be back to its grimy state within hours. But Old Man Hemlock, before he left, had been meticulous about it, and the new regional manager, a woman named Davies who'd only visited once, had made it clear during the handover that consistency was key. I had the lemon-scented spray and a stack of microfiber cloths. It wasn't a bad scent, Actually, a little too cheerful for a place like this. Maybe. But it cut through the musty odor of aging paper and forgotten knowledge. I started with the encyclopedias, Volume 1 of the Britannica. Heavy, solid, I ran the cloth along the gold lettering, watching the dust bloom like a miniature yellow fog. Sarah had been asking me to fix the record player. She said it felt wrong, seeing it sit there unused. It was a beautiful thing. A walnut console my grandfather had given me. I'd promised her I'd look at it this weekend, maybe replace the belt. I hadn't touched it in weeks. Between the bills and these shifts, I barely had time to breathe, let alone listen to music. The kids were good though, surprisingly understanding. Little sponges for worry, soaking it all up even when I tried to shield them. Around 1:30, I moved on to the art books. Oversized, glossy monstrosities filled with reproductions of paintings I didn't understand. I was wiping the cover of a book on Renaissance sculpture when I noticed it. A small rectangular discoloration on the page edge. Not a stain, exactly. More like a blurring, as if the ink had run or the paper had faded unevenly. I frowned. It was unusual. The books were old, yes, but generally well-maintained. I angled the book towards the dim overhead light. The discoloration wasn't just on the edge of the page, it was in the page, a subtle distortion, like looking through warped glass, and it was moving. Not flipping or fluttering. It wasn't wind. It was a slow, creeping shift, like something was pressing against the paper from the inside. I blinked, assuming it was fatigue. These nights blurred together, the hum of the HVAC, the quiet tick of the clock, the endless rows of books. It all started to feel the same. I took a step back, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It was still there. The distortion was more pronounced now, almost shimmering, and it was taking a shape, a vague, indistinct form, like a face glimpsed in a dream. That's when I remembered. Something about recording things. A warning, a rule. I couldn't place it exactly, but a coldness settled in my stomach. Something about not capturing things, not fixing them to a medium. A feeling of dread, like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. I reached for my phone, instinctively. I wanted to take a picture, to show someone, to prove I wasn't imagining things, just to have something. But the memory, hazy as it was, stopped me. A prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a sense that capturing it, documenting it in any way, would be wrong. I lowered my hand. The distortion in the book continued to shift and coalesce. It wasn't becoming clearer, exactly, more insistent. Like it was trying to break through. The lemon scent from the spray suddenly felt cloying, sickly sweet. I could feel my pulse quicken, not with fear, but with a strange, unsettling awareness. I looked around, half expecting to see Hemlock standing there, his face etched with that same haunted expression I'd seen in his last log entry. But the library was empty. Just the books, and the thing in the book. I quickly finished wiping down the shelf, avoiding looking directly at the art book. The air felt thicker now, harder to breathe. I moved on to the next section, trying to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept drifting back to that distortion. When I completed my round, I checked the temperature in the reference section. 65 degrees, normal. But the static reading was off the charts. The needle on the meter vibrated wildly, almost off the scale. I hadn't seen it that high since the night of the protected hours. I wrote it down, forcing myself to be methodical, to treat it like any other data point. I didn't write about the book. I didn't even make a mental note to mention it in the morning. I just logged the temperature and the static and moved on. As I walked away, I risked one last glance. The distortion was gone. The book looked perfectly normal, but the air around it felt colder, and I could swear, for just a moment, I saw a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. Not in the book, but around it, like something had stepped away, something that had been watching me. I finished my rounds, my hand cramping from gripping the logbook too tightly. I kept expecting to hear the scraping sound again, the one from Section B, but there was only silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I kept reminding myself it was just a trick of the light, fatigue, stress, a busy mind. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't. The rules were real, and I'd just broken one. I had a feeling I'd be paying for that mistake. The chipped formica of the returns counter felt cool under my forearms. I was sorting through the drop-off cart, meticulously shelving books. Mostly thrillers and romances, the kind of stuff students devoured before finals. It was calming, actually. Repetitive. Predictable. A welcome break from the static and the shadows and whatever the hell had been happening in the art history section. I stacked a pile of paperbacks, alphabetizing by author. Nora Roberts, Danielle Steele, James Patterson. The smell of old paper and binding glue was oddly comforting. It reminded me of my grandfather's study, crammed with books he'd collected over a lifetime. He'd let me sit in there for hours, just breathing in the scent of stories. The library was quiet, as it usually was on a Tuesday night. Just the low hum of the ventilation system and the occasional creak of the building settling. I glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m., time for another round of readings. Temperature, static, humidity, Hemlock's meticulous routine, now mine. It felt absurd, logging data that clearly meant nothing. But the compulsion was strong. And the thought of what happened when I didn't follow the instructions. I didn't want to revisit that. I finished with the cart and started on the oversized books. Coffee table books, mostly. Art, architecture, photography. As I reached for a particularly large volume on Roman mosaics, I noticed something odd. A door, a small, unassuming door set into the wall behind the shelves, almost hidden by the books. I'd worked here for 3 weeks. I walked this route every night. There was no door there before. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. It was still there. A plain, wooden door, painted the same pale green as the walls. No handle, no hinges visible, just a seamless rectangle set into the plaster. My first thought was maintenance. Maybe they'd been doing work, added a storage closet. But why wouldn't they tell me? And why was it hidden? It felt deliberate. I reached out, running my hand along the wall. The door was solid. It didn't budge. I pressed harder, feeling for a latch, a button, anything. Nothing. It was as if the door had always been there, waiting to be discovered. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. I frowned. I was tired. Probably just imagining things. The lack of sleep was getting to me. I hadn't been sleeping since everything started. Sarah kept waking up with nightmares, and I was getting up with her, of course. It was a cycle. I was about to dismiss it, to chalk it up to fatigue and move on, when I remembered something. A fragment of a rule. Something about a place somewhere you weren't supposed to go. A feeling of dread. A warning. It was buried deep in my memory, a line from the document I'd skimmed on my first night. Something about a restricted area, a place that wasn't on the library blueprints, a place people didn't come back from. I couldn't recall the exact wording, but the feeling was unmistakable. A cold knot forming in my stomach. Don't go there. I briefly considered calling dispatch, reporting the hidden door. But what would I say? I found a door that wasn't there before. They'd think I was losing my mind, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wasn't. I glanced at my watch. 2:28 a.m. Logging time. I could just ignore the door, log my readings, and pretend it didn't exist, but the thought felt wrong, like ignoring a blaring alarm. I walked a few steps away, trying to get a better perspective. The door was still there, a dark rectangle in the pale green wall. It seemed to pulse with a subtle energy, a faint vibration that I could feel in my teeth. Then I noticed the smell. A faint, metallic odor, like old pennies. No, not pennies. Something else, something earthy, like damp soil and decaying leaves. It was subtle but distinct, and it was getting stronger. I remembered something else from the document. Something about consequences, about the rules being absolute, and about avoiding certain places at all costs. I hadn't read the entire thing. I'd skimmed it, figuring it was just bureaucratic boilerplate. Now I regretted my carelessness. I wished I'd paid closer attention. I knew with a sickening certainty that this door was the reason for that rule. the one I couldn't quite remember, the one that warned against entering a forbidden place. I backed away slowly, my hand instinctively reaching for the pepper spray in my pocket. I didn't want to use it. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, but I needed to be prepared. I glanced at the clock again, 2:32 a.m. I had to log my readings. I had to do my job. I had to pretend everything was normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this door, this hidden room, was anything but normal. I forced myself to turn away, to walk towards the reference section, to begin my logging routine. But as I walked, I could feel the weight of the door, the pressure of its presence, pressing down on me. I knew I couldn't ignore it forever, and I knew with a growing sense of dread that it was only a matter of time before I had to face whatever lay behind it. The fluorescent lights in the periodicals room always hummed a little louder, I thought, or maybe it was just the way the sound bounced off all the glossy magazine covers. It was 3:30, and I was doing my rounds, straightening displays, pushing stray chairs back into alignment. Mostly, it was just about looking like I was doing something. Half the time, nothing happened all night except for the building settling and the occasional creak. Tonight was shaping up to be one of those nights. I'd finished with the newspapers and was moving on to the bound journals when I realized I needed to get to the basement for a new stack of back issues of National Geographic. Old Man Hemlock, the guard before me, had been meticulous about keeping everything in order. It was exhausting, frankly, but the university insisted on it, and honestly, I needed the job. The medical bills weren't going to pay themselves, and Sarah's recovery was slow. The basement was accessed by a stairwell at the far end of the periodicals room, tucked behind the microfiche machines. It wasn't a grand staircase, just concrete, functional, and usually cold. I could already feel the temperature drop as I approached. I hated going down there. Not because of anything specific, just the feeling of being underground. Claustrophobic, I guess. I started down, counting under my breath, a habit I'd picked up from my dad. He'd been a carpenter, always measuring twice, cutting once. 1, 2, 3. I focused on the gray concrete of each step, the chipped paint on the handrail. 4, 5, 6. The air grew noticeably colder, carrying the scent of dust and something else, something like ozone. 7, 8, I paused, thinking I'd lost count. No, I was sure I was at 8, but something felt off. The space between my feet and the next step seemed larger than it should be. 9, 10, definitely wrong. There were more steps. I stopped again, frowning. I'd always counted 17 steps. Always. I'd even tested it a few times on previous nights, just to be sure. 17. But I was only on 10. I started again, slower this time. 1, 2, 3, I concentrated, forcing myself to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. 4, 5, 6. It didn't matter how slowly I went. The numbers didn't add up. I was already past 15, and it felt like I should be nearly at the bottom. Then, a flicker of something in my memory. Not a clear thought. More of a residue. A feeling of having read something. A warning. Something about this stairwell. About counting. About discrepancies. It wasn't a complete recollection, just a nagging sense that I'd overlooked something important in that ridiculous binder. The rules. Something about always counting the stairs, and if the count was different, don't continue. Turn around. It felt urgent. The feeling was deeply unpleasant, a visceral pull to not proceed. I leaned against the cold concrete wall, trying to rationalize it. I was tired. It was 3:30 in the morning. I hadn't slept well in days, worrying about Sarah, about the bills, about losing this job if I wasn't careful. My brain was playing tricks on me. It was easy to miscount, especially when you were distracted. I took a deep breath and started counting again. 1, 2, 3. This time, I deliberately slowed down, practically enunciating each number in my head. 4, 5, 6. By the time I reached 12, I knew something was wrong. There were at least 6 more steps than there should be. The air felt thick, almost viscous. The ozone smell was stronger now, and I could taste something metallic on my tongue. I wanted to dismiss it, to convince myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling of wrongness was overwhelming. The memory of that buried rule, that fragmented warning, wouldn't let me. I turned around. The ascent felt different. The steps seemed steeper, the handrail colder. I counted again, obsessively this time. 1, 2, 3, each step confirmed my fears. 17. Exactly 17, the same as always. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a chilling realization. If the descent had added steps, the ascent had corrected them. It hadn't just been a miscount on my part. Something had changed. The stairwell itself had shifted. I reached the top, feeling shaky and disoriented. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My heart wasn't racing. Not exactly. It was more like a dull, heavy thudding in my chest, accompanied by a strange tingling in my extremities, like static electricity. I glanced back down the stairwell. It looked normal, perfectly normal. But I knew better. I knew that underneath that ordinary facade, something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. I didn't get the National Geographic magazines. I couldn't. The thought of going back down those stairs, of facing whatever was happening in the basement, was paralyzing. I finished my rounds, meticulously checking each periodical, avoiding the direction of the stairwell. I logged my readings, my hand cramping as I wrote, trying to ignore the static crawling under my skin. The documentation rule felt particularly oppressive tonight, a silent accusation. I kept expecting to hear the child's voice again, the one I wasn't supposed to investigate. It didn't come, but the silence felt heavier now, charged with an anticipation that was far more unsettling. The forbidden zone felt less like a rule and more like a warning about everything. I sat at the security desk, staring at the blank computer screen, the hum of the fluorescent lights amplifying the pounding in my head. I had followed the rule. I had turned around, but I didn't feel safe. I felt exposed, like I'd narrowly avoided something, but hadn't escaped it entirely. Like whatever was down there was now aware of me. The chipped formica of the security desk was cold under my forearms. I was cataloging the returned books, reshelving the ones that didn't need to be sent back to storage. Mostly textbooks, a few thrillers with dog-eared pages, mindless work, but it kept me moving. It kept the static at bay, at least for a little while. It was nearing 3 a.m., the quietest time, the kind of quiet that felt less peaceful and more expectant. I glanced at the clock. Another hour and a half until my next logging round. Another hour and a half of pretending this was normal. I stacked a pile of history books, the covers worn smooth with use. The library smelled like old paper and dust, a smell I used to find comforting. Now it just felt heavy, like the building itself was sighing. Old Man Hemlock, the previous guard, had loved this place. He'd worked here for 20 years before he retired, then promptly died 6 months later. Heart attack, they said. But I'd read his notes, the ones they left with the security instructions. He'd written about the quiet, too, and about things he couldn't explain. I'd dismissed most of it as the ramblings of an old man, until recently. I finished the cart and started on a new one. Mostly art books this time. Large, glossy volumes. As I was stacking them, I caught my reflection in the cover of a book on Renaissance painting. Just a fleeting glance, but something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. My hair was a mess. As usual, dark circles under my eyes. I hadn't shaved properly. It wasn't my appearance. It was the angle, or the light. The fluorescent lights above were flickering again, a subtle pulse that made everything seem unsteady. I blinked, thinking maybe I was just tired. I looked again, trying to pinpoint what had bothered me. My reflection was still there, of course, but it seemed distant, like I was looking at a photograph of myself, not an actual reflection. And my face. It wasn't quite right. Not distorted, not grotesque, just flattened, like someone had pressed a sheet of glass over my features. I backed away from the books, telling myself it was the lighting. Bad angles, lack of sleep. I'd been working double shifts lately, trying to catch up on bills. Sarah's surgery had wiped us out. The medical bills were relentless. I rubbed my eyes, focusing on the mundane task of sorting the books. But the image lingered, that flattened, distant face. It wasn't something I could shake off. Then I remembered. Something about reflections. Something about avoiding them after a certain time. It was buried deep in the instructions. A single paragraph I'd skimmed over, thinking it was more of Hemlock's eccentricities. Something about not looking into mirrors or windows after midnight. Or maybe it was after 2 a.m. I couldn't recall the exact wording. But the feeling was there. A cold knot tightening in my stomach. It was almost 3:30. I forced myself to look at the clock again. 3:28. Definitely past the time. I tried to rationalize it. It was just a coincidence, a trick of the light. I was letting the other rules get to me, making me paranoid. The stairwell, the hidden door, the logging. It was all building up. But the memory of that reflection wouldn't fade. I needed to check the windows. The large, arched windows at the end of the hall. They faced the campus quad, now shrouded in darkness. They were reflective, especially at night. I hadn't thought about them before. I hadn't needed to. I started walking, my pace quickening. I told myself I was just being thorough, checking for any signs of forced entry. But I knew that wasn't it. I was checking to see if the windows were different. As I neared the windows, I noticed something else. The security cameras. They were all angled away from the windows, pointed at the bookshelves, the reading tables, the security desk. Nowhere near the glass. Another one of Hemlock's quirks, or something else? I reached the windows and stopped. I could feel the static building again, a prickling sensation on my skin. I kept my gaze fixed on the floor, resisting the urge to look out, to look at my reflection. But it was too late. I saw it in the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement, a shape that wasn't mine. It was gone in an instant, but I'd seen it. A distorted, elongated figure standing just behind my reflection. It didn't mimic my movements, it just stood there. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the image to disappear. When I opened them, the reflection was normal. My face, though still pale and tired, looked like my own. But the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It had intensified. I turned away from the windows, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was different from the stairwell. Different from the hidden door. This felt personal. I walked back to the security desk, my legs feeling heavy and unsteady. I had to log my readings. I had to follow the rules. It was the only thing keeping me grounded. But as I sat down and opened the logbook, I noticed something else. My hands, they looked wrong, thinner, older, the skin almost translucent. I lifted them up, turning them over and over in the dim light. They were still my hands, but they weren't quite right. I didn't log the reading. I couldn't. The documentation rule felt impossibly strong now, a weight pressing down on my chest. I closed the logbook and stared at the blank page, a wave of nausea washing over me. I had followed the rule about the windows. I had avoided looking, but it hadn't been enough. Whatever was happening anyway, and it was getting closer. The fluorescent lights of the parking garage felt offensively bright after the library's perpetual dusk. I fumbled with the car keys, dropping them once. My fingers felt thick, not swollen exactly, but like they'd been poured into gloves a size too small. I picked them up, avoiding looking at my hands. It was getting harder to avoid. The drive home was mostly silent. Sarah didn't ask about my night. She hadn't for a while. Not after the first few times I'd tried to explain, stumbling over half-formed sentences about flickering lights and doors that shouldn't be there. She'd started offering me tea, then just a quiet hand squeeze. Now, she just waited for me to get changed. I parked in the driveway and killed the engine. The kids were already asleep. Thank God. I didn't think I had the energy for a barrage of questions, or worse, for them looking at me. I'd started catching them staring. Little, assessing glances. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and laundry detergent. Sarah's attempt to create a normalcy I didn't feel I deserved. I went straight for the bathroom, needing to wash the feeling of the library off my skin. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. It was me, but flattened, like someone had pressed a photograph of my face onto a slightly too small skull. I splashed water on my face, scrubbing hard. The image didn't change, it just felt colder. I found myself avoiding direct eye contact, focusing instead on the tile grout, counting the cracks. A new habit. I hadn't even realized I was doing it until Sarah mentioned it this morning. She'd said, "You've been staring at the floor a lot lately." Her voice gentle. I'd mumbled something about being tired. I hadn't logged a single reading that night. Not one. The logbook was still on the security desk, pristine and accusing. I hadn't even thought about it. I hadn't thought about much of anything except getting through each hour, keeping my gaze lowered, avoiding the windows. Avoiding everything. The next day, I called in sick. Told Sarah I had a migraine. I spent the day wandering the house, rearranging furniture, polishing the silver. Anything to keep my hands busy, anything to avoid looking at them. I kept catching glimpses in windows and the TV screen. They were changing. Slowly, subtly, but changing. I'd quit the job, of course. 2 days after that shift, told Mr. Henderson, the campus security director, it wasn't a good fit. He hadn't pressed me for details, just nodded and said they'd start advertising again. He seemed almost relieved. Sarah went back to work full-time. We tightened our belts. It wasn't easy. The medical bills still loomed, but it was quieter, safer, I'd thought. Now, it's been almost a year. I'm working construction now, physical labor. It's exhausting, but it keeps my mind occupied. And my hands, well, they're stronger, calloused, less noticeable, but still different. I still avoid mirrors when I can. I still find myself counting things. Tiles, bricks, the slats in the blinds. I still can't stand silence. I leave the radio on constantly, even when I'm alone. An oldies station usually, something with a lot of voices. I saw the ad online yesterday. University library, overnight security position available. The same bland description, the same minimal pay. The picture was different. A newer photo of the library's main entrance, but the air around the ad felt familiar. This morning I was making coffee, standing at the kitchen counter, and I noticed it. I always use the same mug, a chipped ceramic thing with a faded picture of a folk singer, Joni Mitchell. I've had it for years, but today the image on the mug wasn't quite right. Joni Mitchell's eyes were looking directly at me, and in their depths I saw not her reflection, but a fleeting, distorted image of the library's windows.